And now we will have Cam Milliken with Genics join him for the Fireside Chat. As Cam makes it up to the stage, I'll just share that we had some member questions that were submitted in advance. They will be asked first, and then we will come from the floor so that you'll see paper and pen in front of you. If you do have any questions, Bob, if you wouldn't mind writing it down, and a few of us will be gathering up the questions. Kelly will sort them out and give them to Cam to ask Minister Horner. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Minister, again for being here today after a very busy day yesterday. And I'm sure it will continue on for a few days. If you don't mind, I'd like to start with the question and the elephant in the room that I think every media outlet asked you yesterday. And that was in regards, and you did touch on it in our earlier session, in regards to the fact that the government had promised tax reduction, a tax cut. And we didn't see that in the budget yesterday. So do you want to maybe just give us a bit of an understanding and an explanation on that?
How about now? There you go. Yeah, great question. I have been asked this, so has the Premier, quite a few times in the last 24 hours. But I would say where to start here. So certainly a campaign promise. Certainly we're committed to implementing this. Budget 2024 lays out the plan. It lays out that we'll legislate in 2025, move to a 9% $60,000 threshold level in 26, and an 8% in 2027. To give you a little understanding of the consequences of what this means to the revenue lines for the GOA, it's about a $1.4 billion change to the revenue line. That's obviously a large amount. We knew budget 2024 was going to be the tightest year in our term. We could see that coming, especially with the lower oil forecast. So definitely came to the Premier and said it looks like we're going to have to buy a little time to implement this properly if we're also going to balance the budget, especially in this year. So we have a little time to ensure we have the fiscal capacity to offer this tax cut. We're still very much committed to it. I do remind folks that by re-indexing the basic personal exemption, that's saving Albertans $980 million a year. It's the highest exemption in the country and growing with inflation. So that continues. We're committed to bringing this tax cut forward, but we just need to buy a little time to create the space in the fiscal plan.
Great. We'll look forward to next year. Some of the questions you've sort of answered in your presentation, so we won't go over those again. So just a couple of things. We have a room full of business people here, many who their businesses revolve around trades. You've said and put in your budget that you're going to support business and education together. And just wondering, I know I work in Atchison, and there's not a day I don't drive through our park where I see signs all over the place saying tradespeople needed, welders, whatever it might be, fabricators, those kinds of things. And I guess the question is do you feel that the government is doing enough considering the current job? We need these people. Are you doing enough to support business in providing opportunities for tradespeople to train them and get them working in Alberta?
Well, it's a great question. I think and hope we are. We've put a lot of effort behind this file, and I know it's very important to the Premier. Like I said in our earlier session, I've received a little criticism for our new, more targeted Alberta is Calling approach. That's part of Budget 2024, but it's targeted specifically at skilled labor. This is people that were, I don't want to say poaching from other provinces, but we're asking them to consider moving to Alberta and applying their trade here. And they will only receive the benefit of the program if they stay and pay their taxes in Alberta. It's a tax credit based system. And I say that I don't feel bad about the program, but I know that every province is having this same challenge. Has a lot to do with the demographics of our country. But Alberta needs more of them. As I said earlier, there's no other province that has the scale and scope of projects that are expected over the upcoming years like Alberta does. I mentioned Dow specifically can, drain, certain skilled laborers across the province with one project. So we want to ensure that, through working with advanced education, we have these seats available, these apprenticeship seats in these spaces. We want to work with post-secondary institutions to make sure that this is a great opportunity for our kids that are thinking about what they want to do. We continue to work on, parity of esteem within the post-secondary space, that, have kids consider that this is maybe something I want to do with my life, and potentially will have even higher wages throughout my life if I consider that, and certainly the work. So that work continues. Maximizing all of our nominee programs within the immigration file in the appropriate spaces. So we're making them, we're recruiting them, we're trying to push the boundaries, those envelopes on the immigration file. I think we're doing what we need to do. Will it ever be enough? We're also working with those companies to try to help them. They have some amazing recruitment programs too, where they're looking out across the entire world to try to bring these people here. So I hope it's enough. I hope it's enough.
Yeah, a lot of great opportunity here. Just on a different note, yesterday in the budget, you referred to the fact that we have debt, and we're wanting that debt is coming due, and you're wanting to pay it off. And just kind of wondering your plans to deal with that. How are you going to pay off the debt, and are you confident that you'll be able to do that as you've stated within your budget?
Yeah, so I find the debt file of this job the most fascinating part of the job. It is honestly, I'm most fascinated by it. I think it's very interesting. Currently, the debt in Alberta is taxpayer supported debt at the end of this fiscal year will be about 76.1 billion. And like I said in my comments, we've paid down 16.6 billion in the last 2 years, which is incredible. But you're seeing what our debt servicing costs are I mentioned from 2.7 billion to 3.4 billion currently. We think we can hold there and decrease in the out years. We will have to borrow a little this year, which is interesting, I'm sure, in a surplus year. But when you leave the retained earnings in the Heritage Fund, when things like ATB have retained earnings in AFSC, you're showing positive on the balance sheet, but it's not cash that you can deploy. So we kind of have to do two things at once. But by leaving ourselves upside with the fiscal rules, when we are in a good position, when oil does what it did 2 years ago, or what it even did to a lesser extent last year, we're forced to either pay down debt or invest in the Heritage Fund through the fiscal rules. So that is a great incentive for us to keep our spending under control, leave that upside for Alberta, and then in the good years, you can actually do something great with it. Something that you may find interesting, currently our debt average is about 3.9%, and that has crept up as we've issued new bonds. We are seeing a little relief. We issued about $1 billion worth of bonds in December at about 4.65%. And then later in January, a slightly bigger offering at about 4.18%. And we do expect that to come down throughout 24 as well when we see interest rates decrease. So I think it's a challenge. The Heritage Fund has returned about 8.4% average over the last 10 years, with costs netted out. So I think you can see the value in paying down debt while saving. And I know the Premier has really spoke to her vision to re-energize the fund. The biggest part of that is leaving the retained earnings in the fund. The numbers she mentioned in her address, they sound like big numbers, but they're totally achievable and realistic. 250 billion by 2050 is achievable without any further deposits, with just leaving the retained earnings in the fund and focusing on the asset composition more like a sovereign wealth fund, which probably means more private equity going forward. We hope to have more to communicate on that in the upcoming year, but it'll take a real commitment for people to borrow in year while leaving the retained earnings in the fund. We're committed to do that, but it'll really mean that we'll have to be prudent in those good years. The fund has had almost $50 billion taken out of it since inception in 1976. $50 billion spent on operating. I think the vision was that it should be something that should grow to be an intergenerational store of wealth that we could then use when our oil revenues declined in the future. So the timing is very interesting, and it's very possible. So that's one thing the Premier and I are very excited about. I don't necessarily always see debt as a bad thing as a rancher from the country. I always said you either have you pay interest or you pay income tax. So that was something my grandpa told me. But I think you definitely want your debt to be aligned with capital and with investments. I'm be very concerned about taking on debt for operating. So that's kind of the balance that we're trying to achieve through budget 24. Much like a household would. I know many people that have some savings that they could probably take out and eliminate some of their debt, but they choose not to because they value the savings. And I think that analogy holds true here too.
So just sort of following up on that a little bit, you talk about the Heritage Trust Fund, that in the event, and just in the event, and I'm sure you've sort of forethought and put some contingencies in place, should something like interest rates rise again, which there's every possibility, energy costs, oil costs drop again, and the revenues are less. What is the contingency moving forward? You want to pay off the debt. How, if those sort of that all happen together, what is your plan to deal with that? Do you borrow from the Heritage Fund again? Do you take out of the Heritage Fund? How do you, because you've projected that some of the revenues are going to increase, but should some of those other things happen, where would you get the money from to continue to pay the debt down?
Well, this is the challenge with Alberta's revenue structure, and why you have to be so disciplined in the good years because of what has to happen in the bad. I was on Treasury Board with Minister Taves shortly after the capital markets froze, and we saw oil go actually negative. And that was quite a story when I heard him explain that he had to walk into the Premier's office and knock on the door and say that they were actually calculating the cash position of the province and when the ship was going to hit the shore in Alberta. Incredible. So we've done a few things around our strengthening our cash position, around liquidity for that dramatic of a situation. But there's no silver bullet here. If it gets that bad, we're borrowing. That's why it's important that we stick with the fiscal framework. We've had 2 credit rating upgrades since we've shown the discipline to stick within it, and I expect more. They love seeing that we're using the good years appropriately to deal with these bad situations. But longer term, if people are thinking about ways to get out of this structural deficit that we all obviously have, if we didn't have oil and gas, you would be talking about taking some of that tax advantage away from Albertans. So I think we want to manage this as best we can without having to do that. Yeah.
So with the emphasis on the Heritage Trust Fund, which I think is fantastic, and I think the government needs to be applauded for their initiative in this and their direction in this, can you tell us a little bit about where that money, the heritage money, is going to be invested? And is Alberta and Albertans always going to be the beneficiary of that money?
Well, definitely to the second part of your question, yes. This is Alberta's fund. We know through, I've seen quite a bit of polling on the Heritage Fund, and one thing that's clear is Albertans love it. They don't know why, but they don't want any politicians to touch it. So I think that's very clear. So I hope through this new re-energizing of the fund, we can give it purpose and vision and how the Albertans understand why it's important. The way it worked for years was the retained earnings in the fund went directly to general revenue. And then, elected people could make the decision to say, I want to make a deposit. I want to take this amount out and put in. And that did happen periodically. I think in the late 2008-ish, there was a little bit of that. And then it happened again a few times under our government. Now the retained earnings stay, and the elected people would have to make a decision to take them out. And I think they would be risking a lot of political capital to do that, because I think we need to stick with this commitment we've made to Albertans.
I'd love it if you gave me some, but you can figure that out later. Just to shift gears a little bit, in the 2024 budget, and I applaud you again on this, you want to make significant investments in childcare services, affordable housing, and supporting our vulnerable populations. You've shown substantial increases in the 2024 budget to do that. And just a couple of things come out of that. How do you see the sustainability? You're putting money into these areas that are so important. How do you see sustainability in that area and in those investments? And then the other side of it too, and I think as Albertans, how do you report to us as Albertans the effectiveness of that money? Are you making a difference? How do we know that's the money, the significant amount of money you're going to spend is really making a difference? And how are you going to tell us that?
Well, there's lots to that question. I'd say every ministry has a business plan, and it's full of, KPIs, key performance indicators and metrics that are meant to do just that, are meant to show that they're actually having an impact in making a certain situation, whether it be childcare or social support services, better. And we track that data, and we try to see if it's having an impact. And if it isn't, then something needs to change. It's a challenge because certainly with population growth, but also a very different and changing province. Back in budget 23, we re-indexed the main social programs, AISH, PDD, families with children with severe disabilities. And so you have those kind of cost drivers built in the system. So it's everything else that you want to bolt on becomes more challenging, especially if you want to smooth out and have stable spending increases in any operating.
Just want to touch for a minute on rural economic development, because we know that rural communities in Alberta are integral to our identity and obviously to our economy. We also know they're integral to the UCP party and their support and their strong support. But rural ridings face some very unique challenges in economic development, in infrastructure, and access to services. So just wondering, out of your budget, what specific strategies do you have in place to help bolster that rural infrastructure and development, the enhancement of, say, public services in rural areas to ensure that they're beginning to thrive right alongside the urban centers?
Well, there's certainly many places in the budget that would, bolster that initiative. Rural Alberta has its challenges, just like Edmonton does, just like Calgary does, but they're very different. We need to help in ways that really play to their strengths. If there's infrastructure that's needed regionally that can help, multiple communities or an entire area, think bigger on the infrastructure planning. So that many communities can take advantage of that. This isn't really rural, but when you take like the industrial heartland, we're trying to take that regional approach when it comes to water. We know Dow and Air Products are going to need all of this water. So there's funding in there in a more regional way to make that happen. It's too big for just one area to try to tackle it. We're going to have to do something very similar in southern Alberta, along Highway 3, Coaldale, Vauxhall, Lethbridge, all that entire area. They all have real water needs, potable water, treated water, but we're trying to think bigger We've even had chats with the Canada Infrastructure Bank to try to help us think bigger instead of every community trying to do their own water and wastewater and build reservoirs, try to do it more regionally. So I think things like that can and will help. Yeah, rural's challenges are different. You got growth on one side, and you got potentially stagnation or declining population in the rest of the places. And I represent a lot of very small communities. And post COVID, it's real interesting what's happened in small town Alberta. There used to be, take a town like Hannah, for example. It's 2,400 people. Pre-COVID, there's probably 300 homes for sale, dealing with challenges of the coal mine closing. Now there's probably under 10. But you're seeing a dramatic change in who's moving there too. A lot of people, I don't want to say fled the big cities, but there was an exodus out of the cities during COVID, somewhat seeking affordability, maybe space. But we have now, I would say, people that are maybe more dependent on social amenities. They show up and buy a cheap house in Hannah because they can afford it, and they're like, I need a car to live here. How do I get around? What, you don't have anything here? It's kind of eye-opening. So you're seeing a big change in those communities as well. But yeah, kind of off topic, but yeah, rural has very different challenges, and we're aware and willing to work with those communities.
All right, time's moving along, so we'll ask give you some questions from the members, and this first one is from Dr. Tammy Nemeth, and I'll just read it word for word to understand. It says, Mr. Horner, given the subtle but ongoing steps by various federal entities, such as the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, the Senate of Canada, and the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, to phase out all types of financing for so-called high-emitting industries, what steps are being taken by your department to plan for the very possible outcome that Canadian financing of Alberta's oil, gas, and agricultural sectors will be cut off in the not so distant future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know there's a feeling that this has happened in a big way already, that we saw the move to lead to divestment in capital for oil and gas. I do think that has changed somewhat from some of the stories that I've heard. We do have conversations. I can't interfere or get involved with ATB in any kind of an operational level, but I do have conversations with their board chair frequently. They're very much overweight in that position and think it's profitable and a good space to be in. So we do monitor it that way. I think you've seen the Indigenous Opportunities Corp, Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corp. We've had to increase their backstop from $2 billion to $3 billion this year, and it's providing capital in that partnership between our Indigenous communities and largely oil and gas in that space. We see this as a viable way that we can help capitalize some projects while helping Indigenous communities and getting things across the line. Just one example.
Cam, sorry, that's all the time we have. Everyone, thank you. We have a hard stop with Minister. We will take the questions that were brought up from the floor, and we will send them to Minister Horner's office. And I know they've always been so good to us in getting all the answers back to us in a timely manner. I'll make sure that those get communicated out to everybody that's been here. So thank you. We will now hear from Kelly Charlebois to thank Minister Horner officially. And Cam, great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. On behalf of Alberta Enterprise Group, thank you very much for your presentation today and taking time the day after the budget to come visit with us. I want you to know that we respect both your sincerity and the thoroughness that you've presented today. We also appreciate your commitment to the continued growth of Alberta as the economic engine of Canada. Finding the right balance between growth pressure, debt repayment, and needed capital, all while helping Albertans lead meaningful and independent lives, is not easy, but you and this government are doing it. We thank you. The budget is balanced and focused on the priorities. Well done. We also want to thank you for your service. And as a small indication of AEG's appreciation, I have two gifts. One is a book titled The Canada Project. It's a piece of fiction for when you have some time in your schedule. And the second is a copy of a vital historic document from 1930 where our natural resources were transferred to Alberta under the Natural Resources Transfer Act. So thank you very much.